So in the previous lesson, what we did was spend some time talking about direct democracy, the idea of direct democracy, the sort of theoretical implications around direct democracy, the idea of every single individual having a certain amount of participation and the ability to have a certain amount of participation within directly within the political process, the process of actually passing law and passing policy. And we noted at the end of the lesson that there are various different practical considerations that make direct democracy in any kind of modern system a particularly uninviting proposition, an uninviting system of governance. But we did note that there was and that there are various instances in which direct democracy still maintains a certain amount of prevalence in modern democratic systems. And in the UK's political system, a direct democracy or direct democratic participation can be seen when looking at the use of referenda and referendums. That is going to be the topic of this lesson, talking about the idea of referendums, looking at the different types of and different forms of participation in the political process. So this is the use of referendums are particularly interesting when it comes to the UK's political system. I'm going to begin by just simply defining and looking at what a referendum actually is at the beginning here. So what actually are referenda, or what is a referendum? Well, it is simply a vote in which all or nearly all are eligible to be asked to either accept or reject a particular proposal. So it is a bit like a general election where you'll go to a ballot box and you'll go and you'll cast your vote in that kind of way. But instead of voting for a person in a general election or a local election, you are voting for a proposition or for or against a proposition. It may be a new law, it may be a new specific form of government policy, or, as is often the case when it comes to referenda in the United Kingdom, it is a change which is constitutional in nature. Quite a major constitutional change that has quite a lot of democratic, political, and legal significance for quite a lot of people. So, in the UK's political system, a referendum is a form of direct democracy because it is a proposal on a new change of direction in either constitutional law or government policy. And it essentially is able to be voted upon by the general population, by the electorate. And there is the reason why it is considered to be a direct democracy. While it is not commonly used, it is very significant in terms of the ability to essentially actuate political change, given that when you look at a representative democracy, the decision to implement a certain amount of policy is based on a political mandate that comes from the people in a general election. But when you look at a referendum, the decision to implement that decision is actually on the basis of the general population's choice. And so it is seen to be more democratic, and it is seen that the government has a greater mandate to implement that change, or to not implement that change if the people so choose. Now, from a legal perspective, there is no overarching law in the UK that mandates how referenda should be conducted, nor is a referendum legally binding onto Parliament, okay? Each referendum requires its own specific enabling legislation. The legislation outlines the terms of the referendum, it outlines the question that is going to be asked in the referendum, it outlines and explains the date of the vote, the rules that govern the conduct of the campaign and the vote itself. So, for example, the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act from 2000 establishes the Electoral Commission and provides a framework for how referendums are to be conducted, including the ways in which campaign financing is operated and spending limits on each of the two major campaigns in a referendum. So the reason why, of course, referenda are not legally binding onto Parliament is because Parliament is sovereign. So what is essentially being done here is an exercise in political sovereignty. If you remember back to our lessons talking about parliamentary sovereignty, we outlined the distinction between legal sovereignty and political sovereignty. This was a distinction that was proposed by the famous constitutional lawyer A.V. Dicey, noting that while not legally binding onto Parliament, there's a certain amount of political binding authority that a referendum has, given that it is the will of the people, and so Parliament would feel politically pressured in ensuring that they conduct themselves in order to essentially actuate that result. A referendum typically begins with a proposal, which may come from government or it can come from political pressure. The 2016 Brexit referendum came as a result of a promise as part of the 2015 general election. The suggestion being fundamentally that if you were to elect David Cameron's Conservative government, they will hold a referendum on membership of the European Union. Now, David Cameron's government probably didn't want to hold a referendum on EU membership, given that David Cameron and his government was particularly staunchly pro-Remain. So, as a result of which, this came through a certain semblance of political pressure. The proposal must then be debated and it must then be approved by Parliament, and this of course involves passing specific legislation which will then set out the details of that referendum. Now, the thing that is most important when it comes to a referendum, at least before the referendum is actually held, is the wording of the question. It is crucial that the wording of the question is both clear and easy for people to understand, but it is also neutral, okay? It cannot be worded in a way that essentially shows and delineates a certain degree of bias one way or another. The institution that is in charge of essentially making sure that all of this takes place in a fair and mannered circumstance is, of course, the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission will review and then provide guidance on the proposed question to ensure that it is fair and, like I said, that it is not misleading. At this point, once the referendum is approved and the question is set, a formal campaign period will begin. During this period, official campaigning groups for and against the proposal are designated by the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission actually designates, as noted here, the groups themselves, even though they may be splinter groups. So, for example, Nigel Farage's group in the Brexit referendum actually wasn't the designated group by the Electoral Commission. There was a separate group that was designated by the Electoral Commission that sort of kept Farage out of the political process. Even though, of course, Farage is seen to be the face of the Brexit campaign in many ways, but in fact it was people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson who were the actual faces of that campaign. Spending limits and rules on campaign financing are of course enforced, and this is obviously to ensure that there is a level playing field. It wouldn't be seen to be particularly democratic if there is a situation whereby there is one side that spends a significant amount more than another. On the designated referendum day, the eligible voters will go to the polling stations and they will cast their votes. This is done obviously by a secret ballot, as is the case when we look at general elections as well. They will mark their preference, yes or no, or other kind of binary choice. So, for example, leave or remain was the Brexit referendum's two options, and they do so on the ballot paper. And after the polls are closed, the votes are counted, and then just like with every single other general election result, the result will be declared based on the majority of valid votes which are cast. In some cases, there will be specific turnout threshold or majority requirements, but might be stipulated in enabling the legislation. But for the most part, it is as simple as casting a vote and getting a majority result. Now, there are various different examples. I've obviously mentioned the 2016 Brexit referendum. In fact, the first referendum that we see in the United Kingdom's political system takes place in 1975. This is the EEC membership referendum. So actually, membership to the European Economic Community, which eventually and subsequently becomes known as the European Union. That was the first referendum. It was the first national referendum in which, as noted here, the voters were asked whether the UK should form part of the European communities. So it says here, remain in the European communities. It was to form part of, to join the European communities. Essentially, there was a deal on the table for membership, and then it went to remaining part of the European membership, the EEC. Of course, the majority voted in favour of staying in. In 2011, there was a referendum on whether or not the UK's general election system should replace first past the post and instead have AV, the alternative vote, which is a more proportional system. It was essentially one in which the result was a majority against the change, and so as a result of which there was no change to the first past the post system, and as a result we have first past the post to this day. Now, given the 2024 general election and given the kind of disproportionate votes to seats ratio that we had, it might even be the case that a subsequent election on and around this kind of electoral system might crop up in the future. In 2014, there was a referendum for members and for individuals living in Scotland on the question of Scottish independence, whether or not Scotland should be an independent country or it should remain part of the United Kingdom. Again, the result was a majority against the voting for independence, and as a result, Scotland remained part of the UK. And then finally, and probably most impactfully, there was a referendum on the 2016 membership of the European Union. This is, of course, the Brexit referendum. This referendum asked whether or not the UK should remain a member of the European Union or should leave the European Union. The result was a majority, a very slight majority, in favour of leaving the European Union. So, as I've noted, and as I mentioned, that when we talk about the binding authority and the legality of a referendum, they are generally seen to be advisory to Parliament, meaning that government is not legally bound to implement the result. If, for example, the Conservative government had the Brexit referendum, it had the result, and they decided to just ignore it and carry on as usual, there would be no legal challenges necessarily. There is no lawful challenge to that particular decision. Now, it would obviously cause a sort of probably a constitutional crisis, given that they would be acting against the will of the government. There might be votes of no confidence, and there might be the removal of that party from power. But in terms of whether or not a court can essentially order the government or order Parliament to follow the referendum result, that is not within the remit of the judiciary, given that Parliament is legally sovereign. But as I mentioned, of course, there is usually strong political pressure to act in accordance with the outcome, and so the implementation of the referendum will depend on Parliament. But fundamentally, it is seen to be inconceivable that Parliament would just ignore a clear mandate from the people to implement the referendum result. So the question, therefore, is how do they implement the result? And of course, given the fact that the Brexit referendum was simply a referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom should remain part of the EU or leave the European Union, it meant that there was a considerable amount of scope for Parliament to debate what leaving the European Union actually meant, what kind of deal was enabled, what kind of deal would be negotiated with Europe, and how would the actual voting upon leaving the European Union be done? Would that require another referendum? Would it require a supermajority? Would it require anything else? Would there be an option to remain as part of the European Union if the deal wasn't good enough? All of these were questions and considerations that were debated basically from 2016 all the way till 2020 or 2019, 2020, quite a significant period of time.